So Inclisiran, we're going to talk about Inclisiran now. So it's not a PCSK9 inhibitor, but it is working in that same pathway. So it's a first-in-type medicine. It's what's called a small interfering RNA molecule. So it's actually working one step ahead in that it is reducing the transcription within the cell of PCSK9. So there's less PCSK9 produced in the first place. And then, as Mo has described, that then has a reciprocal relationship with LDL-C receptors, which then have a reciprocal relationship with prevailing LDL levels in the circulation. So it's the first of its type, but you will be hearing a lot more about this group of medicines over the coming years. So they'll all be ending in Inclisiran. So we've got a hypertension one in the pipeline, another one for amyloid, another one for dementia. So about 20 or so that are likely to be coming down the line over the next few years. So an important new group of medicines that will be entering kind of our practice. Now, the two questions, aside from, well, actually, tell you what, before we go on to that, let's just talk about who's eligible for Inclisiran. So we've kind of touched on this, but important to state that, first of all, we're aiming for a secondary prevention population. Okay, so these patients all need to have had a cardiovascular event already. And they're patients who have then got a persistently elevated LDL-C level of 2.6 or more. So quite generous, really, in terms of some of those European figures that we looked at earlier. And this is with or without statins. So basically, it's after maximally tolerated statin therapy, which I appreciate for some patients doesn't mean an awful lot. But again, it's an add-on therapy, as we discussed earlier, unless, of course, you've got a patient who is intolerant of statins. So you must meet those criteria in order to be eligible for Inclisiran. And that is supported by a nice technology appraisal, which has been published along with the introduction of Inclisiran. And importantly, it's supported by a commercial agreement. So the NHS and Novartis, who are the manufacturers of Inclisiran, have agreed to fund this medicine. So initially there was a 3-year deal, but that's recently been extended to 7 years. So the NHS is receiving Inclisiran at a significant discount up until 2028 at the moment for patients who meet these criteria. And the NICE TA is based on that commercial agreement. So it's for patients who are prescribed Inclisiran in line with that commercial agreement. In terms of how it's administered, so it's an injectable like PCSK9 inhibitors, but it's given as a subcutaneous injection. And the normal dosing schedule is an initial injection, another after 3 months, and then it's a 6-monthly maintenance schedule after that. In terms of how it comes in a pre-filled syringe. It's very easy to transport and store. There's no refrigeration, so none of this kind of cold chain nonsense that we got used to during COVID. It just sits on the shelf. And the injection itself, again, is very straightforward. So again, those of you who've been used to giving things like, say, Prostap over the years, just like a big bullet, this is nothing at all like that. It's much more like a B12 injection, very straightforward, something that most of you will have qualified staff to do in your practice. So other than those administration things, the two things that I get asked most frequently are evidence and side effects. So we'll try to go through that for you now and unpack some of this. So there is evidence with regards to Inclisiran. Mo's absolutely right. There is no MACE data, so there's no outcome evidence, but there is evidence which demonstrates a reduction in LDL-C levels. And the two important trials are Orion 10 and Orion 11. So you can see here, these were both pretty standard randomized controlled trials. A cardiologist called Koshray from Imperial, who was the author, and they're both published in the New England Journal. You can see that covers about 1,500 patients in total with an 18-month follow-up, following that dosing schedule that I mentioned just a minute ago. So Orion 10 to begin with. So these are patients who have got established disease and were on a maximally tolerated statin. And you can see that we got a similar kind of ballpark reduction here to PCSK9 inhibitors, in that the addition of Inclisiran reduced LDL levels by about half, which again is pretty impressive. And it also did that very quickly. So you can see that those levels fell down within 3 months and then was sustained throughout the follow-up of that trial. And then similarly in Orion 11, same kind of design. This time the patient cohort was slightly broader, and so it was patients with established disease plus what's described as risk equivalents. So that's some patients with diabetes or FH or a very high cardiovascular risk. And again, a very similar result in terms of about a halving of LDL, again, on top of maximal therapy. And again, that's happening very rapidly with a sustained effect. In terms of the MACE data, if you're interested, there are 2 trials that are currently recruiting. The first one of those is Orion 4. That's due to publish now in 26. And then there's another one called Victorian 2, which will probably publish in 27. Unfortunately, the pandemic did interrupt the recruitment for both of those trials. So they've both been delayed by a year or more. So we're waiting for that data to be produced, you know, in the not too distant future, but something we're all eagerly awaiting. So on to side effects. So Inclisiran overall is pretty well tolerated, which again is not unexpected due to its mechanism of action. So it doesn't really interfere with other medicines that patients commonly take. It's a very bespoke and targeted treatment. And in fact, the most common side effect, as you can see, was an injection site reaction, which I think we've all seen with any kind of injectable. And in most cases, they were not severe, so they didn't require treatment discontinuation. And similarly, they didn't require any specific treatment themselves. There's no additional lab monitoring with Inclisiran, so you'll probably see these patients anyway, I imagine, once a year. And again, as I expect, a lot of people will be having annual blood tests, which is all fine, but there's no additional monitoring as a result of Inclisiran inclusion in the therapy. So moving on to some of the safety data. So we've recently had some pooled safety analysis published. So these data were presented in New Orleans this year at the American Congress. So it's fairly hot off the press. So it's a combined analysis of the Orion 10, 11, and 9 trials, both during the duration of their scheduled follow-up and then some open label follow-up after that. And they've looked specifically for what's described as treatment emergent adverse events, and then also looking at some of the immunological reactions that is sometimes present with specific therapy. So in summary of those, you can see that overall, in those combined trials, there's now just under 10,000 patient years worth of experience with Inclisiran, involving over 1,500 patients. And in terms of side effects, there were no treatment emergent events. And that includes specifically looking at common problems around hepatic events, muscle events, kidney events, or any new onset diabetes, none of which was reported through this combination analysis. And equally, Inclisiran was found to have a very low immunogenicity in these patients. So the emergence of anti-drug antibodies was very low with Inclisiran. So putting that together now, we can kind of summarize that in terms of this particular analysis, which looked at these 3,500 patients, looking at over about 3 years worth of therapy, 10,000 patient years, the overall profile was very positive and very promising. So these data very much support the use of Inclisiran from a safety perspective in this group of patients who we're currently targeting. So I thought I would finish off with some kind of real life examples rather than concentrating all on theory. So this is another paper published very recently. This is from a colleague called Carl Deeney, who is a GP down in Lincolnshire, and he's been one of the early adopters of Inclisiran. He's got about 150 patients on the treatment at the moment, and he's recently published his early experience. So these 3 case studies come from Carl's work, and he's given me permission to speak to you about them tonight. So this first one here, you can see this lady, she's 58, she's had a stroke and is a smoker, and she's currently taking the full dose of a high intensity statin, so a atorvastatin, so maximally tolerated statin therapy, but despite that, her LDL level is 4.9. So again, referring back to the NICE TA, she fits the criteria for Inclisiran therapy. And you can see in the graph here, so her LDL level started at 4.9, fell down to just 1.3 after 3 months. So she got a 73% reduction in her prevailing levels. Next patient here, I think probably this is the one that I would recognize most commonly from the people that I would have seen in my clinic. So this is a chap, again, nearly 70, multimorbid. So he's had a previous MI, he's got diabetes, he's got hypertension, and he's an ex-smoker. And you can see in this case, he's on both atorvastatin and ezetimibe. But despite that, his LDL level was 3.3. So again, he opted for Inclisiran therapy. And in this case, you can see his level fell from 3.3 to 1.3 after 3 months. Again, that's a 61% reduction. And then finally, again, someone I think you will all recognize, is this is the statin intolerant patient. So this is Ethel, she's 75, again, multimorbid. And you can see she's been through the round the houses in terms of her statin experience. So atorvastatin, fluvastatin, pravastatin, rosuvastatin, and simvastatin all failed, all because of side effects. I know many of you will recognize it, and there's 5 consultations just there for this one patient. And in this particular case, she also had a LDL reduction, albeit unfortunately there's a big arrow in the front of it, but I can tell you that actually her reduction was from 3.9 initially down to 2.5 following, this was monotherapy with Inclisiran. So she got a 46% reduction, which is similar to what we saw in the trials. So finally, just from me, just finishing off, again, just in terms of prescribing, and I think following on from that theme of it being both applicable and practical in primary care. So no special dosing needed, no dosing changes for specific populations. So age is not a consideration for Inclisiran. And similarly, patients with impaired renal function or hepatic function, again, safe to use without any dose adjustment. There's currently no data in pregnancy and breastfeeding, and similarly no data in children. So both of these populations are excluded. And then finally, in terms of missed doses, you can see that 3 months is the magic number there. So if you've missed a dose, but it's less than 3 months, you just give the dose and carry on with wherever you're up to in the planned schedule, remembering that's initiation 3 months and then 6 monthly thereafter. But if you've missed the dose by more than 3 months, you do need to begin again. So you'd have to go back to that initiation stage.